Dear friends, you know that there are many stories with rewrites in this genre, but I try to write my own original stories for you. Today, an incredible family drama that I wrote for you awaits. I invite you to listen on my Purple Heart Stories channel and support with a like and subscribe if you enjoy it. Chapter 1: The New Instructor. Brian Hawthorne never thought that at 38 years old he would have to start life anew. After an injury in Afghanistan, leaving him with perpetual back pain and forcing him to end his Special Forces career prematurely, the former soldier opened a martial arts school for troubled teenagers. Together with his wife, Emily, who worked as a social worker, they helped those in whom society only saw a problem. But the arrival of a new boxing coach, Cole Baker, changed everything. No one, including Brian's 16-year-old son Ethan, could have guessed that behind the charismatic smile of the new instructor hid a terrible person, ready to turn the martial arts school into an incubator for criminals, and Brian's wife into his own lover. Strike, block, spin. The training hall was filled with the rhythmic sound of bodies falling on the mats. Brian, limping, walked between pairs of students, occasionally stopping to correct a stance or show the proper movement. His methods were old-fashioned: discipline, respect, aggression control. Above all, it was important to build character and provide proper moral guidelines. Sport was just a way to become better spiritually. Perhaps that is why local authorities began to send him more and more troubled teenagers. Jake, keep your guard up. Tony, watch your distance. In a real fight, such a mistake would cost you dearly. Brian's voice echoed off the walls, decorated with old army flags and posters with the school's rules. The main one read, "Strength is a responsibility, not a privilege." He was just demonstrating a basic throw to a group of beginners when the hall door burst open. Emily, his wife, looked especially beautiful in a strict social worker's business suit. But Brian didn't notice her first. His attention was drawn to the man walking behind her. Tall, athletically built, with a military bearing and the confident smile of a person used to commanding. Cole Baker radiated that natural charisma that works flawlessly on teenagers. "Brian, meet our new boxing coach," Emily said with undisguised enthusiasm. "Cole is a former professional boxer. He will be teaching additional classes 3 times a week. The program has allocated a grant for expansion and—" She continued to talk, but Brian was no longer listening. He noticed how the student's eyes lit up, especially his son Ethan, when Baker casually took off his sports jacket, revealing the toned muscles under his tight t-shirt. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off the new coach. At 16, he had already achieved impressive results in martial arts, but boxing had always remained his secret passion. His father considered this sport too aggressive for the rehabilitation program, but Cole Baker's appearance seemed to open up new opportunities. "Maybe someone wants to test what I can teach." Cole scanned the hall, and his eyes lingered on Ethan for a moment. There was a challenge in that look, and the guy felt his pulse quicken. He stepped forward before he could think. "Ethan, wait," Brian began to say, but his son was already standing opposite Baker, taking a fighting stance. Cole nodded approvingly and raised his hands in a defensive position. What happened next made everyone in the hall hold their breath. Baker moved like Mercury, with flowing, elusive movements. He dodged every blow from Ethan without landing any of his own. He seemed to dance around the guy, demonstrating not only excellent technique but also some animal fighting instinct. When Ethan ran out of steam, Cole simply put his hand on his shoulder. "You have talent, kid, but you're wasting too much energy. I'll show you how to turn that power into a real weapon." The first training session started the next day. Cole gathered a small group of the most promising students, including Ethan. His methods were radically different from his father's. No long talks about control and responsibility, only pure, practical effectiveness. "In the real world, the strongest wins," he said, showing how to break through an opponent's defense. "All this talk about sportsmanship is nonsense. When you're alone on the street and everything is at stake, there is only a winner and a loser, and I'll teach you to be winners at all costs." These words resonated in the souls of teenagers tired of being lectured. Ethan caught every word of the new instructor, not noticing how a shadow of concern flickered on his father's face as he watched the training through the glass door of his office. Cole spoke their language, offered simple answers to complex questions, and it was more intoxicating than any drug. In the evening after training, Brian stayed in the hall longer than usual. Something about Baker's methods grated on his mind, but he couldn't exactly pinpoint what it was. Perhaps it was the way Cole talked about street fights, too detailed, knowledgeable, uncharacteristic of a professional athlete, or the way he encouraged his students' aggression instead of teaching them to control it. "I think you're too hard on him." Emily's voice startled Brian out of his reverie. She stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with that special grace that once made him fall in love with her. "Cole really knows his stuff, and look how the boys are drawn to him." "That's what worries me." Brian slowly gathered the equipment scattered around the hall. "He's not just teaching them boxing, he's teaching them something else. I can't figure out exactly what yet." Emily came closer, put her hand on his shoulder. "You're just jealous, especially because of Ethan. But the boy needs different mentors, different points of view. It's part of growing up." Brian wanted to object but remained silent. How to explain to his wife what he couldn't yet formulate himself? That fighter's instinct that screamed of danger. Instead, he watched her gather her things, preparing to leave. Lately, Emily had often stayed late at work, explaining it by new responsibilities for the rehabilitation program. "I'll be late today. I need to prepare documents for the committee." She kissed him on the cheek. "Don't wait for me for dinner." Brian watched her leave and suddenly noticed how her walk had changed, more flowing, feminine. Women walk like that when they are in love, or when they want to please. A memory flashed in his head. How Emily looked at Cole during training, how he held the door for her, the light touch of hands when passing documents. No, it's paranoia. Occupational hazard, seeing a threat everywhere. But a worm of doubt had already crept into his soul, and Brian knew that now he wouldn't be able to ignore it. He surveyed the hall once more, checking the locks. Something gleamed in the corner, a phone, forgotten by one of the students. Brian picked it up, intending to take it to the lost and found, when the screen suddenly came to life. A message from an unknown number. "Meeting at 2300, at our usual place. Don't be late, the boss doesn't like to wait." The message was clearly not intended for him. Brian put the phone back, but couldn't fall asleep that night. Chapter 2: Suspicion. A lot can change in a month. Brian Hawthorne felt this especially acutely one evening when his son Ethan didn't come to family dinner for the first time. A plate of cooling food stood untouched, and in the next room the TV hummed steadily, where a reporter was talking about the increasing cases of teenage crime and street gang violence. But Brian was much more concerned about the changes he had noticed in his own son. Another training session had ended, and Brian watched Ethan gather his things. His son's movements had become sharp, nervous, as if some dark energy was constantly simmering inside him. In the corner of the hall, Cole Baker was talking quietly with a group of older students, and Ethan kept throwing impatient glances in their direction. "Maybe we can have dinner together." Brian tried to make his voice sound casual. "It's been a while since we talked." "Can't, Dad, got things to do." Ethan didn't even look up from his sports bag. "Maybe another time." The answer sounded rehearsed, like a tape recording. Brian had heard the same answer for several weeks in a row. Previously, he and his son often stayed after training, practicing complex techniques or just talking about life. Now, these moments seemed to have been erased from Ethan's memory. "Want a ride?" Brian made a last attempt. "No, I'll get there myself." Brian watched his son hurriedly leave the hall, joining Cole's group. Something subtly changed in his gait. A predatory springiness appeared. He was no longer that open, smiling guy his father had known all his life. Now there was a cold gleam in his eyes, and a contemptuous smirk was frozen on his lips. That evening, Brian decided to follow his son. He felt like a scoundrel, creeping through the streets after his own child, but his instinct screamed of danger. The group of teenagers turned towards the old shopping center past Johnny's all-night diner. Brian was going to wait outside, but his attention was drawn to a familiar figure at a distant table. Emily, his wife, was sitting in the dimly lit corner of the cafe, leaning towards Cole Baker. Their fingers were touching on the table, and in his wife's eyes played that special light that used to be meant only for him. Brian froze by the window, feeling the ground slip out from under his feet. Cole said something, and Emily laughed quietly, that same laugh that once drove Brian crazy. Then she leaned forward and quickly kissed Baker, looking around to see if anyone was watching. But Brian had already turned away from the window, trying to cope with the nausea that had risen to his throat. That night, Brian began to track Cole Baker for the first time. The pain of his wife's betrayal turned into cold resolve. Something told him that romantic meetings in cafes were just the tip of the iceberg. He was not mistaken. After midnight, Cole drove his beat-up Ford to an industrial area. Brian kept his distance, remaining unnoticed thanks to his army training. Baker's car stopped near an abandoned warehouse. Dim light broke through the broken windows. Brian parked in the shadows and, limping, moved closer. The old injury responded with pain with every step, but he had learned to ignore it. Through a crack in the peeling wall, he saw a group of people, 6 or 7. They stood in a semicircle, listening to someone. Brian shifted slightly to the side and saw the speaker. A tall man in an expensive suit was explaining something, actively gesticulating. Cole stood nearby, respectfully bowing his head. "There shouldn't be any problems," Brian heard snippets of the phrase. "My people will prepare everything necessary. Your job is to select reliable executors." "Already working on it, boss." Cole's voice didn't sound as confident as in the gym. "There are several promising candidates, especially one guy, a real talent, with the right motivation." Suddenly, one of those present turned towards the crack, and Brian recoiled into the shadows. His heart was pounding like crazy. He recognized this man. 3 years ago, his photo was in all the newspapers in connection with a series of brazen robberies. The name surfaced in his memory: Frank "Butcher" Donnelly, the leader of one of the most brutal gangs on the East Coast. The next day, Brian sat in his office, staring at the computer screen. The search results for information about Cole Baker revealed an unpleasant truth. No trace of a professional boxing career, but 3 arrests for assault, 2 years in a juvenile correctional colony, and another 5 years in a maximum security prison for armed robbery. The last conviction was expunged just 6 months ago. Brian leaned back in his chair, feeling his back grow cold. The documents about past achievements that Cole provided to the rehabilitation program were a skillful forgery. And his wife, who checked these documents, did she consciously help, or did she become another victim of deception? Outside his office window, another training session was unfolding. Cole had gathered a special group around him, the strongest, most aggressive students. Brian recognized their faces: Mike Douglas, expelled from school for fighting with a teacher; Tony Ramirez, arrested 3 times for vandalism; and of course Ethan. His son stood in the center of the group, absorbing every word of the new instructor. Cole was demonstrating a series of strikes, lightning fast, ruthless. These were not sports techniques taught in boxing sections. Such a technique is learned in prison fights, where the goal is, 1, to cripple the opponent as quickly as possible. Ethan repeated the movements with frightening accuracy, and Cole nodded approvingly. "That's right, kid. You have real talent," the coach's voice came through the glass. "You're the best of all I've trained. It's time to move on to real tests." Brian saw his son's eyes light up at this praise. Ethan had always craved recognition, always wanted to prove that he deserved respect. And Cole skillfully played on these strings, like an experienced musician. After each training session, a group of chosen ones remained for additional classes. Brian once tried to stay and listen, but Cole politely but firmly asked him to leave, citing a special methodology that requires complete trust between teacher and students. That evening, locking up the hall, Brian heard a fragment of a conversation coming from the locker room. "Just need to prove you're ready," Cole was saying. "All great warriors have gone through a test. It's called initiation. You want to be a warrior, Ethan. Do you want to pass the initiation and become like the others?" "Yes, sir." There was such devotion in his son's voice that Brian's heart constricted. "Then be ready. Your hour will come soon." The sound of footsteps forced Brian to retreat into the shadows. A group of teenagers led by Cole passed by without noticing him. Ethan walked last, and in the light of the street lamp his face seemed to his father's the face of a stranger, hard, resolute, ready for anything. Brian watched them go, feeling utterly helpless. He had no evidence of Cole's criminal activity, only suspicions and overheard conversations. Report to the police. But what would he say? That the coach is teaching teenagers too harsh techniques, that he meets with former criminals. That's not enough. Moreover, the scandal would immediately ruin the rehabilitation program, which really helped troubled teenagers find their way. And most importantly, he could lose his son. Ethan is old enough to choose who to associate with. Trying to forcibly tear him away from Cole will only push the guy deeper into the trap set by this manipulator. No, you have to act differently. You need to find a way to expose the true face of Cole Baker so that Ethan understands everything himself. Chapter 3: Point of No Return. The confrontation began imperceptibly, with little things that only an experienced fighter could notice. Cole Baker methodically destroyed everything that Brian Hawthorne had built for years. Meditation before training. A waste of time. Exercises for anger control. Losers need that kind of nonsense. The old rules of the martial arts school were cracking at the seams, and the new coach was imposing his own rules, tough, ruthless, mixed with a cult of strength. That morning, Brian was conducting a regular training session with the junior group. The sound of punches on punching bags and the clapping of mats created the usual music of the hall. Suddenly, this harmony was broken by a crash. Something was happening in the neighboring room, where Cole was training with his elite group. Brian hurried there, struggling to overcome the pain in his back. In the middle of the hall lay one of the students, Jimmy Parker, a 15-year-old teenager who had recently joined Cole's group. His nose was broken. Tony Ramirez, one of Baker's favorites, stood above him with a predatory smile on his face. "What the heck is going on here?" Brian stepped forward, but Cole blocked his path. "Everything is under control, Brian." Baker's voice sounded condescendingly confident. "Just a little sparring. Jimmy has to learn to take a punch if he wants to be with us. In a real fight, no one will feel sorry for him." "This is not a real fight, this is a training hall." Brian raised his voice. "There are rules here." "Rules?" Cole smirked, scanning his students. "Guys, who of you has seen rules in the street? Raise your hands who has ever won a fight following the rules of a sports match." No one raised their hand. Ethan, standing in the front row, looked at his father with poorly concealed contempt. In recent weeks, his son had gained muscle mass. His movements had become sharp, predatory. He no longer looked like the boy Brian had taught the first self-defense techniques. "Exactly," Cole continued. "I teach them to survive. I teach them to win at all costs. And you keep your beautiful principles for kindergarten, Brian. With all due respect for the fact that you are the owner here, but—" Tony helped Jimmy up. The boy staggered, but there was determination in his eyes. He clearly wanted to prove that he deserved a place in the group of chosen ones. The other students huddled around, excitedly discussing the duel. Brian noticed how Cole approvingly patted Tony on the shoulder, exactly as Brian himself once did, encouraging the successes of the students. But then he praised them for overcoming their own weaknesses, and not for cruelty to others. "If you can't see it, just leave." Cole's voice sounded almost friendly. "This is a new generation. They need new methods. And you're stuck in the past, friend. In the era of knights and damsels in distress, I guess." Brian felt his face go numb with rage. But anger is a poor counselor. He learned that back in the Marine Corps. Taking a deep breath, he turned to his son. "Ethan, let's go home. We need to talk." "No, Dad." Ethan didn't even budge. "We have training, an important training session. I'm not going anywhere." That night, Brian was watching the school again. He knew that Cole's group often stayed after the official closing and intended to finally find out what they were doing there. The old injury ached from sitting in the car for a long time, but he had learned to ignore the pain over the years of service. More important was something else, a vague premonition of trouble that had been haunting him in recent days. Around midnight, the lights finally went out in the hall. Brian tensed, peering into the darkness. A group of teenagers, about 10 people, slipped out through the back door. Cole walked last, carefully locking the lock. They moved towards a minivan parked around the corner, and Brian, limping, followed them, staying in the shadow of the trees. "Everything is ready," Brian heard Cole's voice. "Tomorrow we will hold the last training session, and the day after tomorrow the job. Have you learned the route?" "Yes, boss." It was Tony Ramirez's voice. "The bus will go along the bypass because of the repairs to the main highway. There's a convenient spot there." Brian froze, feeling his back grow cold. "Bus? What bus?" "Excellent." Cole scanned his students. "Remember, this is your initiation. You will prove that you deserve to be on the team. No pity, no hesitation. Especially you, Ethan. You're my best fighter, don't let me down. I'm counting on you." Ethan stood, straightening his shoulders, in a new leather jacket, a gift from Cole. In the light of the street lamp, his face seemed like a mask, hard, alien. Brian barely recognized his son in this young man. "I won't let you down, sir." Ethan's voice sounded muffled but firm. "You'll get the masks and gloves before the job," Cole continued. "The main thing is to act quickly and harshly. Scare them properly so that no one even thinks of resisting. And if someone jerks—" He made an expressive gesture and the teenagers cackled. Something inside Brian snapped. He knew this gesture. That's how they show a knife in the ribs in prisons. The group loaded into the minivan. Brian waited until they left and rushed to his car. His hands trembled as he dialed his son's number. Beeps, beeps. "The subscriber is temporarily unavailable." He tried again, same result. Returning home, Brian went up to Ethan's room. He needed to find at least some clue, something that would help him understand Cole's plans. In the desk drawer under the textbooks lay a notebook. Brian opened it and froze. A plan of the area was sketched on the page. A place on the bypass road was marked. A diagram of the bus's movement was drawn. And below, the schedule of the regular bus following the Portland-Brighton route. "Oh God, no," Brian whispered. The scheme was drawn with a firm hand, without a single correction. His son, his boy, was planning an armed robbery with the same care as he used to prepare for school tests. Is this really the end? Has he really lost his child? The next morning, he met Emily in the school hallway. She looked tired, with shadows under her eyes, but held herself with the same straight posture that always admired him. Brian gently took her by the elbow and led her aside. "We need to talk." His voice sounded hoarse from a sleepless night. "It's about Cole and about Ethan." "Oh, don't start again." Emily irritably freed her hand. "I'm tired of your suspicions. Cole is doing a great job with troubled teenagers. Look how he has changed Ethan. Our son has finally found confidence in himself." "Confidence?" Brian smiled bitterly. "You call that confidence? Emily, he is turning our students into criminals. He is using the school as a cover for—" "Stop!" Her voice broke into a scream. Several passing students turned around with curiosity. Emily lowered her voice to a whisper. "You're acting like a paranoid. It's all your darn post-traumatic stress disorder. You see enemies everywhere." "Listen," Brian began, but she interrupted him. "No, you listen. Since you were injured and lost your place in the service, you've changed. You've become withdrawn, suspicious. You can't accept that someone can be a better teacher for Ethan than you. Cole gives him something you can't give, an understanding of the real world. Her words hit harder than any blow in training. Brian looked at the woman he had lived with for 17 years and didn't recognize her. Or maybe he just never really knew her. The real world, he shook his head. What Cole is teaching is not the real world. It's a world of crime, violence, and betrayal. And you know it, Emily. Somewhere deep inside, you know the truth. For a moment something flashed in her eyes, fear, doubt. But she immediately looked away. I have to go. I have a meeting at social services. She adjusted the collar of her blouse with a nervous movement. And I ask you, leave Cole alone. For Ethan's sake. For the sake of all these children he is helping find their way. Brian watched her walk down the hallway, straight back, confident gait. Only he noticed how her fingers, squeezing the folder with documents, trembled slightly. Emily always knew how to keep a straight face, even when everything inside was falling apart. In his office, he took out his phone and dialed the number of Detective Reed, an old Army buddy, now working in the police. Listen, Jim, he said when he answered. I need help. Unofficially, it concerns a planned crime. Yes, I know that without evidence you can't do anything. Just listen. Finishing the conversation, Brian sat for a long time, looking out the window at the training hall, where Cole was conducting another class. There was no choice. He would have to act himself. But how to save his son without destroying the program that helped so many other children? How to get him out from under Cole's influence without losing him forever? There were no answers. It remained only to wait and prepare for the worst. Chapter 4: The Robbery. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town came to life in the pre-dawn twilight. Cole gathered his group an hour before the appointed time, 10 teenagers in black sportswear, with balaclava masks in their hands. They stood in a semicircle, listening to the last instructions of their mentor. In the dim light of a single lamp, their faces seemed like wax masks, pale from the tension and fear that they tried to hide behind ostentatious bravado. The bus will go along the bypass at 7:30, Cole's voice sounded calm, as if he was conducting a regular training session. Mark and Tony will block the road with the truck. When the bus stops, we act quickly, windows, doors, control of the salon. Jake and Pete are responsible for the driver. The rest work with the passengers. Ethan. He put his hand on the shoulder of Brian's son. Ethan stood up straight, straightening his shoulders like a soldier before an important mission. A strange fire burned in his eyes, a mixture of fear and excitement. You come with me to the middle of the salon. Show everyone what you have learned. This is your chance to prove that you deserve to be part of our family. Family? This word echoed in the empty room. Cole knew which buttons to push for teenagers from dysfunctional families. For children who feel lonely and misunderstood, this word had a special magic. We leave the phones here. Cole took out a plastic container. No traces, no accidental calls. Is that clear to everyone? Yes, boss, an uneven chorus of voices. And remember, no pity. Pity is weakness. And we are not weaklings, are we? We are not weaklings, boss. Black sports bags were laid out along the wall. Cole opened one of them, took out a baseball bat. This is to scare them, only to scare them, understood. No bodily harm unnecessarily, but if someone jerks. He made a short, sharp swing with the bat, and the teenagers involuntarily recoiled. Everyone, except Ethan. He watched the movements of the mentor with some kind of fascinated admiration. Something stirred in the far corner of the warehouse, and one of the guys, nervous Pete, almost jumped. Cole raised his hand reassuringly. Relax, only our own are here. 2 men appeared from the shadows, strong, with the characteristic prison brand. One carried a box with gloves, the other a bag with some tools. Meet our support group, Cole smirked. They'll make sure the cargo is properly distributed. The way he pronounced the last word made several teenagers flinch. But it was too late to retreat. They had gone too far. Each of them remembered the initiation ritual, when Cole gathered them in a circle and they swore allegiance to each other, making cuts on their palms. An ancient, like the world, rite of blood brotherhood. Now they were bound, both to each other and to Cole. The morning bus on the Portland-Brighton route slowly crawled along the bypass road. The driver, old Sam Donahue, cursed, bypassing the potholes. The road repairs dragged on, and the detour route turned into an obstacle course. About 20 passengers dozed in the cabin, the usual morning crowd. Office workers, a couple of students, an elderly lady with her grandson, several housewives with bags. Emily Hawthorne sat by the window, absent-mindedly looking at the dreary landscape of the industrial zone floating behind the glass. She had an important meeting at the Brighton Social Services. The truck appeared as if from nowhere, an old Ford, blocking the road across. Sam braked sharply, the bus swerved, the passengers leaned forward, and then began what police reports would later call a lightning attack by an organized group. Black figures in masks appeared simultaneously from all sides. The sound of broken glass, screams, baseball bats hitting metal. The door slammed open under the blows of a crowbar. Two men in masks tied up the driver before he could reach for the panic button. "Everyone stay in your seats." The voice in the mask sounded hoarse, distorted by adrenaline and fear. "Hands behind your heads. Whoever twitches will regret it." The elderly lady screamed, hugging her grandson. One of the passengers tried to jump up and immediately received a blow from the bat on the back of the seat, very close to the head. "I said don't move." Cole, in a mask, but his characteristic gait of a former boxer gave him away, moved along the central aisle, pointing out targets to his fighters. "Bags, wallets, phones, all on the floor. Quick. And you," he poked the bat towards a young clerk trying to hide his briefcase under the seat, "especially quickly." Ethan followed him as ordered, collecting valuables into a sports bag. His movements were clear, practiced, but everything inside was trembling. It turned out to be nothing like training. The smell of fear in the cabin, muffled sobs, pleading looks, all this hit his nerves harder than any blow. He had just reached the woman in the gray business suit when something made him freeze. The scent. That same light floral scent that always smelled of Mom. Emily looked up, and Ethan saw in her eyes the same horror as in other passengers. She didn't recognize him in the mask, but he knew every feature of that face, every wrinkle at the corners of his eyes appearing when she smiles. Now she was not smiling. The hand with the bag fell limply. Somewhere on the edge of his consciousness sounded Cole's cry. "Why are you frozen? Work." But Ethan couldn't bring himself to move. The reality of what was happening crashed down on him like a cold shower. Here it is, the point of no return. The moment when you need to decide who you really are. I can't," Ethan's voice trembled under the mask. "Can't, boss." Cole was nearby in one swift motion. His eyes behind the mask slits blazed with rage. "What do you mean can't? We talked about it. No pity, no doubts. Either you are one of us or—" "No," Ethan shook his head, stepping back. This is my mother." Silence hung, broken only by the muffled crying of the passengers. Cole slowly turned to Emily, who still didn't understand what was happening. His posture changed. That special relaxation appeared, which precedes the attack in experienced fighters. "So what?" New notes sounded in his voice, angry, mocking. "What a touching meeting. Family drama live. So what now, little Ethan? Will you run to Daddy?" He stepped towards Emily, casually playing with the bat. The other attackers froze, watching the events unfold. Even the passengers quieted down, feeling that something special was happening. "You're a loser, Ethan, always have been. I tried to make a man out of you, but you're still a mama's boy." Cole leaned towards Emily. "And your family? Dad is a cripple, playing the cool warrior. Mom, who jumps into bed with the first person she meets. And you're a pathetic disappointment." His hand reached for Emily's purse. "Let's see what we have here. Oh, a gold ring. A gift from her husband or mine? I'm already confused." Emily winced, recognizing the voice. Understanding flashed in her eyes, replaced by horror. And then, the shock on her face turned into pure, unadulterated fear when she saw something behind Cole's back. The entrance door of the bus slammed off its hinges. A silhouette appeared in the opening, limping, but no less formidable for that. Brian Hawthorne moved with the special purposefulness of a person who knows exactly what to do. "Get away from my wife." His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it that everyone who had ever served under his command remembered. Immediately. Chapter 5: The Climax. Time in the bus cabin seemed to freeze. Cole slowly straightened up, still holding Emily's purse in his hand, and turned to Brian. His posture changed subtly. From careless it became combat, ready for a lightning movement. "Here comes the hero, Dad," he drawled mockingly. "Can't let go of the past, can you, Marine? Still trying to save someone." Brian stood in the aisle, leaning on a metal handrail. His eyes quickly assessed the situation: frightened passengers, teenagers in masks, frozen in indecision, Emily's pale face, his son's lost figure. The old wound throbbed with pain, but now was not the time for it. "Guys," he addressed the teenagers, ignoring Cole, "you have a chance to fix everything. Just leave. The police will be here in 5 minutes." Several masks turned to the exit. There was a special confidence in the voice of the former Marine that makes people obey. But Cole was faster. "Stand," he barked. "Whoever takes a step towards the exit is a dead man." He threw the purse and gripped the bat more comfortably. The first blow was lightning fast, a side swing capable of breaking a skull. But Brian was waiting for it. He ducked, letting the bat whistle over his head, and immediately answered with a short straight to the jaw. Cole staggered back but stood his ground. His mask flew off, revealing a face distorted with rage. The next series of blows was terrible. Years of street fights and prison brawls taught him to kill. Brian blocked, evaded blows, but every movement echoed with a flash of pain in his back. They circled in the aisle of the bus, exchanging blows. Passengers huddled against the windows. Someone was trying to get out. One of the teenagers jerked to help his mentor, but Ethan blocked his path. "Don't interfere." Cole performed a classic combination: jab, cross, hook, and got Brian in the ribs. He swayed, losing his balance. The old injury let him down, his leg buckled, and he fell to one knee. Cole's triumphant cry echoed off the walls of the salon. "So what, hero?" Cole loomed over the defeated opponent. "Did you think you could compete with the young? The time of cripple Marines is over." He grabbed Brian by the throat and pressed him hard against the handrail. The metal painfully dug into his neck. Brian tried to break free, but the grip was iron. Years of working with a punching bag had not been in vain for Cole. Black dots began to dance before his eyes. "Watch carefully, Ethan," Cole raised his voice. "This is what happens to weaklings. This is what real strength means." Emily screamed, trying to get up from her seat, but one of the teenagers roughly pushed her back. Brian felt his grip on Cole's wrists weaken. A little more and... The blow came from the right, lightning fast, of terrible force. Cole flew to the opposite wall of the bus, crashing into the glass. Ethan stood over him, tearing off his mask. His face was white with rage. "You taught me that strength is everything," the guy's voice trembled. "That nothing is more important than victory. That pity is for weaklings." Cole tried to get up, but the next blow sent him back to the floor. Ethan moved as if he had only done this all his life, perfect technique, brought to automatism in endless training sessions. "But you know what I realized?" Each word was accompanied by a new blow. "Real strength is protecting those you love. And you're just a coward and a bandit who can only make fun of the weak." Cole tried to block, but Ethan broke through his defense with the same ease with which the teacher once broke through the defense of the student. The roles have changed. Now the former mentor looked frightened and confused. not understanding how his best student could surpass the teacher. The final blow knocked Cole out. He lay against the far wall of the bus with a broken nose. Ethan stood over him, breathing heavily, his hands still clenched into fists. The other teenagers in masks froze, not knowing what to do. Their idol, their invincible leader, had been defeated. "Everyone stay in their seats." Brian's voice, hoarse after strangulation, filled the cabin. He got up with difficulty, leaning on the handrail. "The police are already here." And indeed, the wail of sirens was heard from outside. Detective Reed, the same army friend of Brian, professionally assessed the situation and began to give orders. "Everyone lie on the floor, hands behind your heads. Medics here, we have wounded." But Ethan no longer heard him. He looked at his father, who, limping more than usual, was approaching him. Memories swirled in his head. Their first joint training session, when his father taught him how to fall correctly. Endless talks about honor and responsibility, which then seemed so boring. Pride in his father's eyes after his first victory in the competition. "Dad," Ethan's voice faltered, I'm sorry." Brian silently hugged his son. They stood like that in the middle of the ravaged bus, while the police put handcuffs on Cole and his accomplices, while paramedics examined the injured passengers, while Emily sobbed silently, covering her face with her hands. At that moment, both son and father understood. No matter what happened next, there would be a trial, there would be consequences, but they had passed the main test. Together. Chapter 6: Aftermath. The house greeted them with oppressive silence. After the interrogations at the police station, after all the explanations and paperwork, they finally returned, all three of them, but no longer as a family, but as strangers forced to settle the last affairs before their inevitable parting. Emily sat on the edge of the sofa, clutching a cup of long cold coffee. Her usually impeccable hairstyle was disheveled, and her face was frozen with the expression of a person suddenly awakened from a long nightmare. Brian wearily sank into the armchair opposite. Ethan remained standing by the window, looking out at the empty street, as if he couldn't bring himself to turn to his parents. "I have something to tell you." Emily's voice sounded cracked. "There's no point in hiding it now." She took a deep breath, as if about to dive into icy water. "I helped him, Cole, from the very beginning. It was I who forged his documents for the rehabilitation program. I turned a blind eye to his methods. I was so blinded." "You slept with him?" This didn't sound like a question. Brian spoke these words calmly, almost without emotion, as if stating a long-known fact. "Yes," Emily lowered her head. "But I swear I didn't know about his real plans. He said he wanted to help troubled teenagers, give them a purpose in life. I believed him. God, how stupid I was." Ethan turned sharply from the window. "Did you think about me, about what he was doing to me? You saw how I changed." "Ethan," she reached out to her son, but he recoiled. "No, Mom, don't. I'm also to blame. I let him fill my head with all this nonsense about strength and superiority. But you should have protected me. You're my mother." Tears streamed down her cheeks, smearing the remnants of mascara. She was no longer the self-confident woman she had seemed all these years. Now, a broken person sat before them, having lost everything: honor, family, self-respect, faith in her own ability to distinguish good from evil. The trial of Cole Baker was held behind closed doors. Too many minors were involved in the case. Brian sat in the front row, watching as his former employee, now in a prison robe, listened with ostentatious indifference to the charges. Organizing a criminal group, involving minors in criminal activity, armed assault, document fraud. When it was his turn to testify, Brian spoke clearly and to the point. He told how he noticed the first signs of trouble, how he followed Cole, how he collected information. The prosecutor nodded, the jurors made notes. And Cole looked at him with the same smirk as on the bus, as if everything that was happening was just an annoying delay before a new game. But his smirk faded when Brian took out the phone, the one forgotten in the hall, with the message about the meeting. It was the final nail in the coffin of the accusation. Detective Reed had tried his best. All of Cole's connections with the Donnelly gang were documented. All of his previous crimes surfaced. 20 years without the right to parole. The judge's voice sounded like the blow of a hammer on iron. Ethan sat 3 rows behind his father. He was to speak next, but as a witness for the prosecution. The district attorney, taking into account his help in catching the criminals and his sincere confession, offered a deal: probation in exchange for testimony against Cole and his gang. Defendant Ethan Hawthorne, the judge spoke more softly. Given your age, sincere remorse and assistance to the investigation, the court sentences you to 3 years of probation with mandatory visits to a psychologist and community service. I hope you have learned a lesson from this story. Yes, Your Honor. Ethan stood up straight, looking the judge in the eye. His voice had strengthened since that day on the bus. Now it sounded with the confidence of a person who had gone through a test and emerged from it stronger. The divorce was quick and quiet. Emily did not claim anything except personal belongings. On the day the documents were signed, she stood for a long time on the threshold of their former common home, as if she wanted to say something, but in the end she just left. Ethan watched her go from his room window, and his heart was torn between love for his mother and the inability to forgive her betrayal. She will always be your mother, Brian said then, putting his hand on his son's shoulder. No matter what happens. Ethan only nodded. That evening they sat for a long time on the back porch, watching the sunset for the first time in many months, just talking. Not as teacher and student, not as supervisor and criminal, but as father and son, trying to find their way back to each other. The martial arts school reopened a month later. New name, new rules, but the same spirit, discipline, and respect above all. Now they trained together. Brian shared his experience, and Ethan helped with physical exercises when his father's injury made itself felt. Keep your elbow closer to the body, Brian said, watching his son work with a newcomer. That's right, correct. The force of the blow comes from the ground through the whole body. Ethan nodded. He now understood these lessons quite differently. Each movement, each technique carried not only technique, but also philosophy. Strength is given not to suppress the weak, but to protect those who need it. The state mixed martial arts championship became something of an exam for him, a test not only of physical fitness, but also of spiritual maturity. In the final fight, he faced a guy a head taller and 10 kilograms heavier. The stands roared, the coaches shouted instructions, but Ethan heard only his father's calm voice from his corner. Remember who you are. Remember what I taught you. When the referee raised his hand in victory, Ethan did not celebrate or show off to the public. He simply looked at his father and smiled, that same smile that he had as a child before this whole story with Cole. Sincere, pure, real. The gold medal of the championship now hung in their school next to his father's military awards. But more important than any medals was that they had become a family again, perhaps not complete, perhaps with scars on their souls, but real. That family where strength is measured not by blows, but by the ability to forgive and support each other. And in the evenings they still sat on the back porch, watching the sunset, and talked about everything in the world. There was a lot of work ahead, a lot of trials, but now they knew for sure. Together they could cope with anything. Because true strength is not what Cole taught. True strength is the ability to get up after falling and start over without losing faith in goodness and justice. If you enjoyed this story, then support the author with a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your emotions in the comments. Thank you.